Bitcoin has recently experienced a strong bounce following a recent retracement, and when analyzing current market conditions, everything is pointing in one direction. Let's look at the data to see just how much higher BTC could go in the coming days and weeks. So let's get right into it with the Bitcoin Hodl Waves chart we have here on BitcoinMagazinePro.com. And what we can see, all I've done here is just isolate. So we're looking at the age bands from 10 years down towards 6 months plus. Now what this is showing us is the percentage of circulating Bitcoin held by the wallets within these age bands. Now what we're doing by excluding the 6 months and below is excluding new market participants, short-term holders. There's lots of data to suggest once a holder actually holds onto their BTC for over 155 days, they're actually classified as a long-term holder, which I know doesn't actually seem that long, but their chances of selling after holding on for that period decrease dramatically to the point where they're much more likely to actually hold on for an indefinite period of time. Now what we can do is if we just zoom on over the most recent few years, we can see that every time Bitcoin has these big rallies to the upside, it's followed by the actual percentage of Bitcoin held by these long-term holders decreasing, which makes sense, of course, as Bitcoin is rallying to the upside. Those that have been holding Bitcoin for months or even years or decades are likely to potentially take a little bit of profit on their positions. And when we have these periods of choppy consolidation or periods at just points where long-term holders don't necessarily think they're getting good value for money by actually selling their Bitcoin, we see this actually continue to increase. This might also be short-term holders actually holding onto their Bitcoin. Potentially they buy at cycle peaks and become long-term holders as they're holding onto their Bitcoin for a longer period of time. What we can see in this most recent move, we had something very similar. I mean, I'm talking just over the past few weeks here. We had the long-term holder supply of Bitcoin, the circulating percentage of long-term holders begin to decrease. I've not scaled this chart very well at all. And this was, of course, coinciding with Bitcoin's most recent run up to a nearly new all-time high, followed by a retracement. And now what we're actually seeing is, if we just zoom out again, because I don't think I've done this scale very well at all, that this is actually looking incredibly positive. We're seeing now almost no profit taking from these long-term holders. And if we just go to long-term holder supply chart, I think this looks a little bit better. I think I can explain this a little bit better. What we can see, again, rather than just looking at the percentage, here we're pretty much looking at just the actual BTC circulating amount. Now this isn't going to line up exactly because the hodl waves is 6 months plus, whereas the long-term holder supply, like I said, is 155 days or more. But what we can see, the actual profit taking, the actual amount of Bitcoin that had been transferred from long-term holders to short-term holders has actually, over the recent few days and couple of weeks, actually begun to start increasing, indicating that once again, we're seeing a decreased amount of profit taking from long-term holders, even as Bitcoin is just on the cusp of new all-time highs. We're around $120,000 following our retracements around 110K. And after this recent bounce, you'd maybe consider again, so a little bit more profit taking from long-term holders, but we're really not seeing that right now. And again, this is reiterated by something like the SORP spent output profit ratio. If I just once again zoom in over the most recent cycle, we can see it's almost counterintuitive to do what a majority of people are doing. If we see a huge amount of profit taking, such as towards cycle highs, not necessarily cycle highs, but local highs after we've had these big run-ups in price action, at that point, it maybe makes sense to scale back our accumulation, potentially lock in some profits yourself. And again, when we see huge amounts of realized losses, people selling Bitcoin for substantially less than what they bought it for, again, these capitulation events are usually good periods of time to actually begin accumulating Bitcoin. And again, recently, if we just zoom in over the most recent few months, we can see that as Bitcoin was rallying higher, the amount of profit we were seeing realized, again, continued to increase, which is very normal, very healthy to see throughout a Bitcoin bull market. Again, we can't actually see prices increase unless there are people willing to sell their Bitcoin for higher prices. So once we actually see this increase, again, it's pretty healthy until it gets to these excessive, potentially overheated levels. But now, again, as we've seen this slight retracement in the Bitcoin price action, we were almost seeing days where Bitcoin actually had realized losses. I mean, these are just positive values on the SOPR, again indicating that people aren't necessarily taking profit like they were even just a few weeks or months ago, which again gives us some further insight and clarification that these long-term experienced big Bitcoin holders aren't taking profit at these levels, which at pretty much new all-time highs gives us a lot of confidence that we can move higher. And again, just looking at something like the value days destroyed, which really reiterates this. If I just scroll around here, we can see that again, this reached fairly heightened levels, which may have partially been influenced by that big 80K whale we saw that actually moved their Bitcoin about a month or so ago. But again, if we just zoom in, we can see that this has massively decreased, indicating a huge reduction in the profit taking by these long-term, and especially when looking at this metric, large Bitcoin holders, which again gives us a little bit more breathing room. It's just supply and demand economics. When the amount of supply actually hitting the open market continues to diminish, even if demand remains the same or ideally increases, then we're going to see that positively reflected in the Bitcoin price action. Now what we can do is just go over to TradingView here, and I've loaded up a couple extra charts that we can look at. Now the first and foremost, this bottom one here is the Bitcoin Everything Indicator, which is actually aggregating a multitude of different metrics to look for confluence, not just in on-chain data, but macroeconomic, technical, derivative, etc. So what we do is when we bundle all of these together, we can see historically, it gives us some good indication that when we're not just looking at one metric in isolation, we're not just looking individually at certain data points. When we actually put all of these together, there's a huge amount of parallels and confluence throughout these data points. And when we see all of them, when we see global liquidity rapidly increasing, when we see a huge amount of realized profit taking, when we see funding rates incredibly high, all of these point towards the market getting overheated. And the same is true for the downside. When we see a huge amount of shorting in the market, realized losses, capitulation in real time, these are great areas to accumulate Bitcoin. If I actually just look at the strategy tester here, I can see that this has actually outperformed buy and hold since 2009, accumulating during these green areas and distributing during these red areas. I won't go too much into this strategy, I've covered it extensively in previous videos. What I wanted to mention was right now, we're currently right around this 50 level. Now this doesn't necessarily indicate that we're only 50% of the way through the market. As we can see in previous cycles, we didn't reach necessarily a value of 100, and during bear markets, we don't reach values of 0. What we can see is this indicates a huge amount of upside potential remaining for this cycle. If we look to the previous cycle, for example, the last time we were at these values of around 50 is when the price was around 12K. Now, of course, as I said, that doesn't necessarily mean we're 50% of the way through the length or price appreciation of the cycle, but we can see during the following few months, Bitcoin's price rallied substantially from, as I said, 11K, as this metric went from a value of around 50 to 90 towards a Bitcoin price of around 40K. And then again, following that, we had further peaks as Bitcoin approached 50 and then $60,000. So this does give me some confidence that this bull cycle still has considerable upside potential remaining. Again, not just looking at on-chain or macroeconomic derivative technical, but by combining all of them into one. Now, if we are to isolate just technical, because here we've already covered on-chain data, we've already covered supply and demand economics and investor psychology and looking at the everything indicator, but just looking at a purely technical lens as well, we can see that looking at the Crosby ratio, which recently actually came back down to this 0 middle level, which throughout Bitcoin bull markets, again, gives us some good indication that potentially we have a big move up ahead of us. Which look to the most recent times where we've actually come back down and retested this level. It was as Bitcoin just was about to have this big run up to above $100,000. And again, as we were hovering around here, just as Bitcoin again had this big retracement to around 74, 75K before we ran higher. And then most recently we ran up after our retracement, came back down, tested this 50 level, and again, most recently came up to around 120K. So the fact that we've come down and reached this level gives us some confidence. And what I like to do with the TradingView iteration of this metric, which is available to you if you're a site subscriber, is actually drop it down to the 4-hour time frame. Gives us some slightly more intra-move ideas of what the Bitcoin price action is likely to do. And again, I'll just zoom in on the most recent price action here, and it does take a second to load. What we can see is as we had this recent dip, as we retraced around $111,000, this actually dipped into the accumulation zone. Now, as I said, this is on the 4 hours. So this isn't necessarily something you need to look towards for major profit taking or major accumulation. But when you look at this metric and look for confluence, so for example, this actually occurred as Bitcoin was retesting its previous all-time high, as we were oversold on this level, as we were seeing the SOPR looking like people were potentially about to realize some losses in the market. All of these point towards a good area for accumulation and a good area for dollar cost averaging into your positions. Now, most recently, again, we had a point where we actually reached into this upper, potentially overbought, overheated market conditions. So the slight retracement we've had over the past few days, again, isn't too surprising. But if we just look at the Bitcoin price action over the past few months, this is incredibly healthy. This isn't something that's making me think we're anywhere even close to a Bitcoin price cycle peak. I know people are going to look at the wicks to the upside, but all we've done recently is come back down and retest previous highs. And this price action, when you see this stepping up in price action, is incredibly bullish to see. We come up, have potentially a little bit of overheated, overextended market conditions. We come back down, retrace, retest previous highs that we've set, turn them into support after they were previously resistance, come back up again, turn the next level in support, move higher, come back down, test it into support, move higher. And again, this is all incredibly healthy to see. Now, again, when we're actually looking at how much higher this Bitcoin price action move could go, of course, the first level we need to look towards is the current all-time high. Even though we had this recent big rally to the upside, it didn't actually breach the previous high we have around $123 nearly $1,000, about $123,000. But one thing we can do is, of course, predicting levels of price action resistance above where price is very difficult to do. We don't know where the resistance is. We don't know where price action is going to go towards. Of course, the big psychological levels have always played a factor in Bitcoin, whether that be 10K, 20K, or most recently 100K or 120K. But one thing I like to do is use these Fibonacci extension levels. Now, I have heard some people say they'd like to use them where you actually grab price action from the previous cycle lows and go up to the next cycle high. That's fine. What I prefer to do is actually grab these current cycle low and go to the previous cycle high. So I like to go from right to left rather than left to right. But if we just zoom in, what we can see is the right to left. So this cycle's, or the previous cycle low to the previous cycle high, actually give us a Fibonacci extension level towards this $122,000. So it's pretty much perfectly outlined the resistance that we're currently facing. So we can break above that. Again, I can zoom out, and here's why I wanted to show both instances of these Fibonacci extension levels, because they're actually giving confluence at around this $144,000 to $145,000 level. So we can see Bitcoin continue to break higher, break above its current all-time high. Again, maybe come back down, turn this into support, which we have done historically throughout this cycle very well. And again, come back up and maybe test this $143,000, $145,000 level. That'd look pretty good for in my opinion, for price action. And again, if we draw some levels at potentially 130K and roughly around 140K, and again, it's not going to be exactly to the dot. It's going to be within a few percent, a few $1,000s of these levels where people are actually stepping in, trying to front run, maybe overextending and liquidate a few short positions, etc. Of course, there's a lot of game theory when it comes into this. But overall, when looking at the Bitcoin market, when analyzing it, things look pretty good. Now, if we just go back to Bitcoin Magazine Pro here, another one I'd want to look at, actually price prediction target level, is if we look at the short-term holder MVRV. Now, this is looking at the ratio of the average accumulation price or cost basis for new market participants. Now, what we can see is when we actually just divide these, we get the standard MVRV ratio. Now, what we can see is in this cycle already, we've had peaks of 1.33, 1.43, 1.37-ish. Again, now what I've done, and this is something we actually discuss quite a lot in our weekly analysis post for site subscribers, is actually creating custom metrics based on a lot of the existing data we have via API. So what I like to do is actually draw something around here, which is at about this 1.33 level. Now what we can see, drawing points at this 1.33, we've tested it multiple times in multiple cycles. So here in 2016, 2017, this 1.33 level really acted as a key point of investor psychology when new market participants were on average about 33% up on their positions. Again, this is when people start getting a little bit excited, a little bit potentially overexcited, taking screenshots of how much profit they've made, etc., telling their friends how they should have bought. This is usually when we see a little bit of a retracement. And again, I like to say it, on-chain data is just mass psychology quantified, and we can see multiple instances at the exact same point occurring once again in this cycle. And I also like to point towards about the 1.66 level, if I just draw somewhere around there, because again, this has also marked pretty major peaks for the Bitcoin price action. If I just remove all of them, we can see in the previous cycle 1.74 around there, 1.75, 1.73, 64, and then in the last cycle again 1.56, 67. So about that 33% and 66%. Of course, we can extend far beyond that. We can not even reach anywhere near those. But what I've done is, like I said, use these rough points to actually create bands around the short-term holder realized price. Now, this is throughout the entire history of Bitcoin. I know it's a bit small and a bit hard to see. What I will do is actually just move myself over to this side, so it's potentially a little bit easy for you guys to see. And what I've done is just zoom in over the current cycle. So what we can see is even in this cycle already, we've come up and tested this 1.33 band multiple times. We've come up here, and then we ran up to $74,000, $75,000, we tested it here. And as we first surpassed $100,000, we tested it over here. Now this is currently sitting at, if I can just grab the chart, $142,500. But as we can see, the short-term holder realized price is almost always trending to the upside during these bull markets, especially when price is above this and new market participants are accumulating above this average cost basis. So we see this continue to trend to the upside. It's not going to be long before it's really coinciding and providing some confluence of potential resistance and price action targets of what we saw with the Fibonacci extension levels around $143,000, $145,000. So for me, if we are to see a big move to the upside, of course, there's going to be a resistance along the way, but somewhere around that 140, 145K is where I'm really going to be eyeing up a big Bitcoin move to the upside before we have probably a little bit of a retracement before we really start the euphoric phases of the remainder of this bull market. Also, if you haven't already, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to ensure you're receiving all of our content as soon as it's released, and make sure to check out all the resources we've discussed today, as well as the many more that are all available on BitcoinMagazinePro.com, your #1 source for Bitcoin analysis. So just to summarize, Bitcoin has recently experienced a strong rebound following its retracement, and when analyzing the current market conditions through an on-chain technical, macroeconomic, and derivative data lens, there is substantial upside potential remaining for the coming days, weeks, and even months if we see a long drawn-out euphoric phase of the remainder of this bull market. And if we are to continue to reach new all-time highs, then the next logical places to look towards are the key psychological levels around $130,000 to $140,000. And then of course we have those Fibonacci extension points at around 145K as well, as some confluence there. And again, if we look at some on-chain data and typical investor behavior when looking at the short-term hold of realized bands, again, that's also reaching about this 145K level. Now, one thing I would like to say is, while it's great to look at these potential points of how much higher the Bitcoin market could go, again, rely on the data rather than fixed price levels. If we're getting to 137K and everything's flashing, we're seeing a huge amount of profit taking from long-term holders. We're seeing a huge amount of retail FOMO and derivatives getting out of control, etc. At that point, it doesn't matter if we're not quite at $140,000. These are the points at which you need to be taking action. It's great and lots of fun to look at the price charts and think, wow, look how much higher we could go, but realistically focus on the data and react rather than try to predict. If you like this video, then please visit BitcoinMagazinePro.com, where our analytics help you to cut through the noise to make informed, data-driven decisions about Bitcoin. With over 150 live charts, personalized indicator alerts, in-depth crypto industry reports, API access, and more, all for a fraction of the standard industry price. And let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below and on social media. Do you think that Bitcoin is in fact primed to move substantially higher over the coming days, weeks, and months? Or do you think that we are maybe getting a little bit ahead of ourselves? Maybe we're hitting former resistance and we are due a little bit more choppy consolidation or even retracement in the Bitcoin price action? As I said, let me know. I look forward to reading and replying to them. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.